The heat of that first summer in the Nebraska territory was a physical weight. It pressed down from a sky so vast and empty, it seemed to mock the very idea of shelter of safety of any human claim upon the earth. The year was 1884, and the land stretched in every direction without apology, without mercy, without end. But before we begin there, let me show you how this story ends. Picture a field after the wrath of God has walked across it. Splintered wood scattered for a quarter mile in every direction. Shattered glass catching the light like tears frozen on the ground. Furniture, clothing, children's toys, pages torn from family Bibles, all of it strewn across the prairie, as though a giant hand had reached down, seized an entire town, and crushed it like a paper lantern. Not a single wall standing, not a single roof intact, nothing. Nothing except one house. Low against a hillside, its roof covered in wild grass and prairie flowers, a small structure sat untouched. It looked less like something built and more like something that had always been there, a part of the earth itself, no more disturbed by the storm than the hills, or the rivers, or the ancient bones buried deep beneath the soil. A woman stood in its doorway. Her hair was loose and tangled. Her face was calm. A black dog sat at her feet, its tail giving one slow, uncertain wag against the ground. They had called her home a dirt house. They had called her mad. They had signed legal papers to tear it down. And now it was the only thing left. This is her story. It begins 6 months before that day on the very same piece of ground when she had nothing but 2 hands and a letter she was afraid to read. 6 months earlier, Vera Merriweather stepped down from the mail coach at the crossroads 2 miles east of a town called Prairie. She was 28 years old. She carried a small trunk, a land deed folded into thirds, and a weariness that had settled so deep into her bones it had become part of her skeleton. The dog jumped down after her, a sturdy, dark-furred animal with amber eyes and a broad chest. His name was Boulder. Her son had named him that. Alton, 3 years old, had looked at the puppy with those serious gray eyes of his and said the dog was big and heavy like a rock, like a boulder. And the name had stuck the way things children say have a habit of sticking, burrowing into the soft tissue of memory where they can never be fully removed. Alton had been dead for 6 months. His father, Norris, for 6 months and 11 days. Diphtheria had come through their town in Pennsylvania like a quiet fire, moving from house to house without smoke or flame taking what it wanted. It took Norris first. Then 11 days later, while Vera was still wearing the black dress from her husband's funeral, it took her boy. She did not speak about this. Not to the coach driver who had tried to make conversation for 200 miles. Not to anyone. The grief lived inside her like a stone she had swallowed, too large to pass, too deep to reach. She carried it the way she carried everything now, in silence. Boulder sniffed the ground in wide circles, his nose working the unfamiliar scent of prairie soil and buffalo grass. Vera watched him and remembered, without wanting to, the way Alton used to wrap his small arms around the dog's neck and press his face into the dark fur. The memory arrived without warning, sharp and bright as a shard of glass, and she pushed it down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that remembering during daylight hours was a luxury she could not afford. At night, in dreams, she had no such control, but that was a problem for later. The land was waiting. Her plot sat on a stretch of open prairie, broken by a single gentle rise, a low hill that faced east with a long sloping back that ran down to the west. The grass was tall and golden, moving in the wind like the surface of a slow ocean. There was nothing else, no trees, no fences, no buildings, just the grass, the ski, and the relentless sun. Vera knelt. She pushed her hands into the soil. The surface was hot and dry, baked hard by weeks of summer heat. But a few inches down the earth changed. It became cool, damp, dark. She crumbled it between her fingers, feeling the texture bringing it to her nose. It smelled ancient. It smelled alive. Loam and mineral and root and thyme all compressed into a handful of dirt that most people would wipe from their palms without a second thought. But Vera was not most people. She had been taught to read this soil the way other women had been taught to read scripture. As she examined the land deed more carefully that evening, turning the folded paper over in her hands, something slipped from between its creases. A smaller piece of paper, yellowed and soft with age, covered in handwriting she recognized instantly. The letters were shaky, written by a hand that had once been strong, but had grown uncertain in its final years. Her grandfather's hand. She read the first line. "Vera, if you are reading this, it means you have arrived at the place I chose for you." Her heart knocked against her ribs. She folded the letter closed without reading further and pressed it into the pocket of her dress next to her chest. She was not ready. She was afraid that once she read it all, there would be nothing left of him to wait for, no more words to discover, no more of his voice preserved in ink. And she was not ready to let go of that. Not yet. She made camp that night with a canvas sheet stretched between two stakes and a small fire that Boulder watched with the devoted attention of a creature who understood that fire meant food and food meant survival. Vera ate dried meat and hard bread and stared into the flames and began to plan. Her grandfather, Thaddeus Meriwether, had been a man of the earth. Scotch-Irish by blood, Pennsylvanian by birth, he had spent 10 years of his youth on the Great Plains in the 1840s, living among the grass and wind and weather before returning east to marry and raise a family. But the prairie had never left him. It lived in his hands, in his voice, in the quiet lessons he gave his granddaughter on their small farmstead when she was a girl of 7. She remembered those lessons now not as words in sequence, but as sensations. The feel of his calloused palm over hers, guiding her fingers into the soil. The weight of a sod brick in her small hands. The smell of cut grass and exposed root. He had taken a spade one afternoon and cut a perfect square from the pasture, then flipped it over and held it up for her to see. The underside was a dense mat of roots, thousands of them, tangled and woven, and gripping the soil with a strength that seemed impossible for something so fine. "You see that, Vera?" he had said, his voice rough and low, like wind through a fence. "The grass holds the earth together. The roots are the thread, the soil is the cloth. You don't need nails, you don't need timber. The land holds its own shelter. You don't build on it, you build with it." She had not understood then. She understood now. The town of Prosperity sat 2 miles to the west. Vera walked there the following morning and to purchase supplies, Boulder padding along beside her, and what she found was a settlement drunk on its own ambition. The main street was a wide strip of packed dirt lined with buildings in various stages of construction. Pine and oak lumber, shipped at enormous cost from forests hundreds of miles east, was stacked in great piles. The sound of hammers filled the air, a constant staccato of iron on wood, of men building upward toward the sky, with the confidence of people who believed that height was the same thing as strength. She entered the general store first and met Bernice Osgood. Bernice was standing on the porch with 2 other women, her dress clean and pressed to sharp creases, her hair pinned in a severe bun that seemed designed to communicate discipline rather than vanity. She had the kind of eyes that could measure a person in half a second and file them into the appropriate category before a single word was spoken. She measured Vera now. "Where are you coming from, dear?" "Pennsylvania." "And your husband, is he meeting you here?" Vera paused. "I am a widow." Bernice's expression shifted not to sympathy but to something more complex. A calculation. "Oh, you poor thing. And you have family out here, someone to take you in." "Number. Do you attend church?" Vera looked at her. "I have not decided yet." It was the wrong answer. Vera saw it register on Bernice's face like a door closing. In Bernice Osgood's world, a new arrival, especially a woman alone, was supposed to need the community. She was supposed to be grateful, deferential, eager to be absorbed. Vera was none of these things, and Bernice recognized this the way a dog recognizes a cat instantly, instinctively, and with immediate hostility disguised as concern. At the bank, Vera met Fletcher Underhill. He was 55 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a handshake that it communicated ownership rather than greeting. He examined her land deed with the careful attention of a man who considered every piece of paper in the territory to be in some way his business. "Fine piece of land," he said. "I can set you up with a lumber account. Get a crew out there by next week. We will have you in a proper house before the first frost." "Thank you, Mr. Underhill, but I will build my own way." Fletcher smiled the way adults smile at children who announce they intend to fly. Not unkind, but utterly dismissive. "Suit yourself, Mrs. Merriweather. But the offer stands. You will find it difficult out there alone." On her way out of town, Vera passed a house under construction on the main street. A man was up on the frame, shirtless in the heat, driving nails, with the efficient rhythm of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Emmett Haskell. He was 32, lean and sunburned, with the hands of someone who spoke to the world primarily through the things he built. He was the best carpenter in prosperity, and he knew it the way a surgeon knows he is good with a knife. Not with arrogance exactly, but with an awareness so deep it had become inseparable from his identity. He watched Vera enter the general store and emerge with a spade, a cutting plow, and a coil of rope. No nails, no lumber, no hammer. Emmett stopped mid-swing and watched her walk back out toward the prairie, the tools over her shoulder, the dog at her side. Something about the way she carried that spade bothered him. It was not the grip of an amateur. It was the grip of someone who knew what the tool was for. He drove the next nail harder than necessary and tried to forget about it. Vera began building the next day. She marked the perimeter of her home on the south-facing slope of the hill, a modest rectangle, and started to dig. The work was brutal. She used the cutting plow to slice thick ribbons of sod from the prairie, each one roughly 3 feet long and 18 inches wide. The grass still clung to them, and beneath the grass the roots formed a dense, fibrous net that held the soil together with a tensile strength that no nail or mortar could match. These were her bricks, her timber, her walls. She lifted each one and stacked it offset like a mason laying stone, pressing each layer down into the one below, fitting them tight. The sod was heavy, 30 to 50 pounds per brick, and there were hundreds to cut and carry in place. Her hands blistered on the first day. By the third day, the blisters broke and bled, and she wrapped her palms in strips torn from her spare petticoat and kept working. Her back seized in the mornings and did not release until she had been moving for an hour. The sun baked the sweat into a white crust on her skin. Boulder watched from whatever sliver of shade her body cast, his amber eyes tracking her movements. Sometimes he dug alongside her, his big paws churning the earth with a purposeless enthusiasm that made her almost smile. Almost. One afternoon, while packing sod into the base of the north wall, Vera's fingers closed around something small and smooth in the dirt. A pebble, round pale gray about the size of a thumbnail. She held it up and her breath stopped. Alton used to collect these. Every walk they took together, his small hand would dart to the ground and come up with a stone, a pebble, a fragment of quartz, and he would hold it up with that expression of pure wonder that only a 3-year-old can produce and say, "Look, Mama, I found a treasure." His pockets had always been full of them. When they undressed him for the burial, small stones had fallen from his clothes and scattered across the floor, and that sound, that gentle clattering, had been worse than any other sound in Vera's life. Worse than the doctor's words, worse than the silence that followed. She sat on the ground and held the pebble and did not move for a long time. Boulder came and pressed his wet nose against her hand. She put the stone in her pocket. She did not throw it away. She did not cry. She just kept it. Then she stood up and went back to work. The evenings were the hardest. She sat by her small fire eating what little she had, and the sounds of prosperity drifted across the prairie toward her. Faint laughter, the tinkling melody of a piano, the distant bark of a bay that was not Boulder. Sounds of a world she was not part of. She did not resent them. She was simply aware of the distance the way a sailor is aware of the depth of the water beneath his hull. At night, she dreamed of Alton. Every night, he was always in a room she could not find the door to, calling for her. His voice muffled and small. She would search hallway after hallway, door after door, and never reach him. She would wake with Boulder pressed against her side, the dog whimpering softly in his own sleep, dreaming his own version of the same loss. Word of Vera's project reached Prosperity within the first week. A woman alone digging into the earth, stacking blocks of dirt into walls. Riders passing on the track into town would slow their horses and stare at the strange wound she was carving into the hillside, then ride on shaking their heads. Bernice Osgood was the one who shaped the town's opinion as she shaped most things. At her weekly tea gathering, surrounded by the women whose social survival depended on her approval, Bernice spoke with the measured concern of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "I worry about her," Bernice said, setting her cup down carefully. "Truly I do. Losing a husband and a child, that kind of grief can break a person's mind. Does a woman in her right senses choose to live underground? Only animals burrow and people who have lost their way." It was masterful. By framing her contempt as compassion, Bernice gave the entire town permission to mock Vera while feeling virtuous about it. The sentiment spread like ink through water. Men began riding out on Sundays ostensibly to hunt, but really to observe the low earthen walls slowly rising from the prairie. They called it the Dirt House, Vera's Folly. They laughed about it in the saloon and pitied it in the church, and in both places the conclusion was the same: the widow had lost her mind. Then one night Vera heard something outside. She was sitting by her fire boulder beside her when the dog's ears pricked forward. A low growl built in his chest, but he did not bark. Vera reached for the spade and moved to the edge of the firelight. There, perhaps 50 yards away, a man stood in the moonlight, perfectly still, watching the half-built sod wall. He was not hiding. He was studying. He stood there for several minutes, his head tilted slightly, and then turned and walked back toward town. Vera gripped the spade and watched the darkness where he had been. Boulder's growl faded. The dog had not barked, which meant he recognized the man's scent. Someone from town. Someone who had been close enough before and for Boulder to learn his smell. She did not sleep well that night. The next morning, she found a small bundle on the ground near her doorway. Wrapped in a piece of clean cloth was a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of wild honey. There was no note, no name. Vera knelt and held the bread and looked out across the empty prairie, and for the first time since arriving in Nebraska, her eyes burned. She did not know who had left it. She did not know if the person who watched in the darkness and the person who left bread in the morning were the same or different. She only knew that in a landscape of hostility, someone had performed a small act of grace and that it had nearly undone her. Fletcher Underhill rode out on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks after Vera had begun construction. He dismounted, removed his hat, wiped his forehead with a clean handkerchief, and approached with the patient, purposeful stride of a man accustomed to solving other people's problems, whether they wanted them solved or not. "Now, Mrs. Merriweather," he began, "I have come as a friend. The town is concerned. A woman alone doing this kind of work, he gestured at the walls. It is not safe. The structure could collapse. You will have insects, snakes, mold. These are not idle concerns. Vera continued fitting a sod brick into place. And beyond safety, he continued, there is the matter of community. People will not accept you living this way. A woman on her own needs the support of her neighbors, needs the church, needs the structure of civilized life. Vera placed the brick and reached for another. Fletcher paused. He seemed to weigh his next words carefully, and then he said them anyway. Your husband, Norris was it, and your boy, do you think they would want to see you living like this in the dirt? He lowered his voice, and what came next he likely believed was gentle. It looks like you are trying to bury yourself alongside them, Mrs. Merriweather. And I say that with the kindest of intentions. Vera's hands stopped. She set the sod brick down. When she turned to face him, something had changed in her expression. The careful blankness she wore like armor had cracked, and beneath it was not sorrow but anger, white and clean and trembling. Do not speak their names, she said, and her voice shook not with weakness, but with the effort of restraint. You did not know my husband. You did not know my son. You do not know anything about me or about what I am building or why. My husband died in a fine wooden house, Mr. Underhill, a beautiful house with pine floors and glass windows and a shingled roof. That house did not save him from the sickness, but at least it did not betray him. She drew a breath. You are standing here using the names of dead people to pressure a living woman into doing what you want. I am asking you to leave. Fletcher replaced his hat. His face had gone through several shades of color during her speech and had settled on a mottled red that was not quite anger and not quite shame, but some uncomfortable territory between the two. He mounted his horse. Do not say you were not warned, he said, and rode away. That evening, Emmett Haskell sat at the small desk in his workshop and opened his notebook. By the light of a single candle, he drew from memory what he had seen on his nighttime visits to Vera's construction site. The precision of it, the deliberateness, the way each element worked with the one beside it and the one below it, creating a whole that was greater than its parts. It was not random. It was not primitive. It was engineering a system refined by generations of people who had understood the prairie in ways that Emmett, with all his skill and training, simply did not. He closed the notebook. His hands were not steady. The next morning, he went to see Fletcher Underhill. I have been out to look at the Merriweather property, Emmett said. Professionally speaking, the structure does not meet any recognized building standard. The walls could shift. The roof, if she even manages one, will be a collapse risk. It is not safe. Every word was a lie. Emmett knew it. The walls were sound. The engineering was elegant. But admitting that meant admitting that a woman with no formal training had built something that challenged the fundamental premise of his entire career. Every house he had raised, every beam he had set, every nail he had driven, was predicated on the belief that wood was the right material and that his way was the correct way. Vera's house whispered that there might be another way, and Emmett was not ready to hear it. Fletcher nodded slowly. Thank you, Emmett. That is exactly what I needed to know. Vera met old Jewel on the road into town on a morning in late August. Jewel was sitting on a bench outside a small, weathered shack at the far edge of Prosperity, a structure so old and gray it looked like it had grown from the ground rather than been built upon it. Jewel was perhaps 72, small, brown, and still as a stone. Her hands worked a piece of wicker into a basket, but her eyes were on Vera. She did not speak. She did not wave. She simply looked at Vera with an expression that contained no judgment, no pity, no curiosity, only recognition. Then she nodded, once, slow, deliberate. Vera nodded back. That was all. In a town where every interaction had been an assault of whispered scorn or loud silence, a single nod from an old woman carried the weight of a cathedral. It said, "I see you, I know what you are doing, and I am not afraid of it." Vera walked on, bought her flour and salt, endured the cold stares and the conversations that stopped when she entered and resumed when she left, and walked back to her land. But she carried that nod with her like a lamp. The walls of her sod house grew higher through September. By early autumn, they were chest-height thick and solid, curving slightly inward as they rose. From a distance, the structure was beginning to disappear into the hillside, becoming part of the landscape, a low hump of earth and grass that the casual eye might pass over entirely. This was not a flaw. This was the design. Her grandfather had taught her that the best shelter does not announce itself. It does not stand tall and dare the wind to knock it down. It lies low. It holds fast. It lets the storm pass overhead. On a cool evening in late September, the light failing early, Vera was fitting one of the final bricks into the upper wall when she straightened and looked west. Something made her pause, a feeling more than a sight, a quality in the light or in the air or in the particular silence of the insects at that hour. She looked down toward Prosperity. The town was loud with construction. The new town hall, a grand two-story wooden building, was nearly complete. Its frame rose against the darkening sky like a skeleton, standing upright, proud and exposed. Hammers rang. Men shouted to one another. Somewhere someone was playing a fiddle. Then Vera looked east across the open prairie and saw a figure standing at the edge of the tall grass, perhaps 100 yards away. A young woman, brown hair, one hand resting on a belly that was just beginning to show the curve of early pregnancy. She was not coming closer. She was simply standing there, watching the way a person watches something they cannot look away from. Vera recognized her. She had seen her in town, always near Bernice Osgood, always quiet, always watching. The young woman's name was Estelle Caulfield, and the expression on her face was nothing like the expressions Vera had grown accustomed to seeing in Prosperity. There was no contempt in it, no pity, no amusement. There was longing. Then someone called from the direction of town, a man's voice, and Estelle turned quickly and walked away. Her pace hurried as though she had been caught somewhere she was not supposed to be. Vera watched her go. Then she looked back at the wall she was building, the last course of sod bricks waiting to be set, the low shape of her home taking its final form against the ancient hillside. She did not know what the young woman had been looking for out here, but she understood the look on her face. It was the look of someone standing outside a window, watching a life she wished she had the courage to live. Vera placed the last brick. She pressed it down firmly with both hands. Boulder sat beside her, his tail moving slowly against the ground. The sun set behind the hills to the west, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, and Vera sat in the doorway of her unfinished home and watched the light fade over a town that did not want her, and a prairie that did not care whether she lived or died. She was still here. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The house was finished on the first day of October, and it changed nothing. Vera had expected in some quiet corner of her mind that she would not have admitted to that completion would bring a shift, that the town would see the walls standing firm, the roof sealed tight with living prairie grass, the small, deep-set windows catching the autumn light, and understand that anyone would walk out from Prosperity, stand before her home, and say, "I was wrong. You were right. You." No one came. What came instead was something worse than mockery. The town stopped laughing. When her house had been half built, it was a joke, a spectacle, something to ride out and gawk at on Sunday afternoons. But now that it was complete, now that it was clearly, undeniably a dwelling, a place where a human being slept and ate and lived, the laughter dried up and something colder took its place. The people of Prosperity looked at Vera's finished sod house and felt, without being able to articulate it, threatened. Her home was an argument. Its very existence said that there was another way to live on this land, and another one was something Prosperity could not afford to consider, not when every family in town had mortgaged their futures to Fletcher Underhill's bank for the lumber that now creaked and groaned in their walls every time the wind blew. So they did what communities have always done when they cannot refute an argument. They attacked the person making it. The interior of Vera's home was a single room, perhaps 14 feet by 18, with a packed earth floor she had smoothed and hardened with water and tamping. The ceiling was low but not oppressive, supported by a framework of salvaged cottonwood branches she had found along a dry creek bed 3 miles south. The thick sod walls held the temperature steady cool when the October sun still burned hot, warm when the first November frost turned the prairie white overnight. The wind, that constant, maddening presence that rattled every wooden structure in Prosperity, was reduced inside Vera's home to a distant murmur. Something felt more than heard, like a pulse in the walls. She hung dried herbs from the ceiling, wild sage, prairie lavender, yarrow. She set a small iron stove in one corner, its pipe running up through a reinforced section of the roof. And on a nail driven into the sod wall beside her bed, she hung Alton's shoes. A pair of small leather boots, scuffed at the toes, the laces still tied in the clumsy knots his fingers had made the last morning he wore them. Every night before she closed her eyes, she looked at those boots. Every morning when she opened them, they were the first thing she saw. One night in those first weeks after completion, she dreamed of Alton again. But this dream was different from the ones that had come before. He was not trapped behind a door she could not find. He was running across the open prairie, his small legs pumping through the tall grass, and he was laughing. He turned and shouted over his shoulder, "Mama, come, look what I've found," and held up a fistful of dark earth roots, still dangling from it, and his face was bright with the particular joy of a child who believes he has discovered something no one else has ever seen. She ran after him, but the grass was too tall, and her legs were too slow, and he disappeared into the golden shimmer of the horizon, still laughing, still calling for her. She woke with her hand outstretched, reaching for nothing. The pebble she had found in the dirt was still in the pocket of her dress, hanging on the hook beside the bed. She pressed her fingers against it through the fabric and felt its small round solidity, and held on. It was the first week of November when Reverend Merle Osgood declared war. Merle Osgood was a lean, austere man of 50, with a voice built for carrying. He had the gift of making conviction sound like compassion and judgment sound like concern. And he deployed these gifts every Sunday from the pine pulpit of Prosperity's church with the precision of a man who understood that spiritual authority properly wielded was more powerful than any bank or badge. His wife Bernice had been working on him for weeks. Not overtly. Bernice never demanded. She suggested. She wondered aloud. She left silences in the right places and let her husband fill them with his own conclusions. By November, Merle Osgood had concluded that Vera Merriweather was not merely eccentric. She was a spiritual problem. The sermon that Sunday was about light and darkness. Merle spoke of those who choose to dwell in shadow, who turn away from the fellowship of the righteous, who reject the structures. And here he paused meaningfully, that God has provided for civilized life. He spoke of pride disguised as independence. He spoke of stubbornness disguised as wisdom. He did not say Vera's name. He did not need to. God made man to stand upright, Merle said, his voice rising to fill the small wooden church. To reach toward heaven, to build toward the sky. Anyone who chooses to crawl into the earth has turned their back on the Almighty himself. Vera was not in the church. She was outside on the wooden sidewalk, having come into town to buy salt. The church doors were open to let in the mild November air, and Merle's voice carried clearly into the street. She stopped walking. She stood perfectly still and listened to every word. Through the open doorway, she could see the backs of the congregation, the rows of bonnets and broad hats, the rigid posture of people receiving instruction. She could see Bernice Osgood in the front pew, her chin lifted, her hands folded, radiating the particular satisfaction of a woman whose campaign had reached its intended culmination. She could see Fletcher Underhill, his eyes fixed on the pulpit, nodding slowly. And she could see in the third row from the back Estelle Caulfield, who was not nodding, whose face was turned slightly toward the door, as though she could feel Vera standing there. One by one, other heads began to turn. A ripple of awareness moved through the congregation as people realized that the subject of the sermon was standing in the doorway listening. The church went quiet. Merle stopped speaking. For a long, suspended moment, every eye in Prosperity was on Vera Merriweather. She did not defend herself. She did not argue. She did not cry or shout or explain. She looked directly at Reverend Osgood, held his gaze until he was the one who looked away, and then she turned and walked back down the sidewalk, her boots sounding on the boards in a rhythm that was the only noise in the world. That night inside her home with the door closed and Boulder pressed against her legs, Vera did not cry. She did something that frightened her more. She sat in the darkness, her back against the sod wall, and felt nothing. Not anger, not determination, not grief, just a vast gray emptiness like a sky with no horizon. And into that emptiness came a question she had been holding at bay since the day she arrived. What if they are right? Not about the house. She knew the house was sound. She knew it in her hands and her bones and the memory of her grandfather's voice. But what if they were right about her? What if she was not a woman of wisdom and resilience, but simply a woman so broken by loss that she had burrowed into the ground because she could not bear to stand in the light? What if this was not building? What if it was hiding? The doubt was worse than anything Fletcher or Bernice or Merle Osgood had done to her because it came from inside, from the place where she kept her certainty, and it poisoned the water at the source. She did not sleep that night. She still walked into Prosperity for supplies. But the town had changed toward her. Mothers pulled their children to the far side of the street when Vera passed. Men who had once at least nodded, however coldly, now looked through her as though she were made of glass. The general store owner served her without making eye contact, sliding her flour and salt across the counter with the tips of his fingers as though her money might carry contamination. Reverend Osgood's sermon had given the town's cruelty a theological foundation. Vera was no longer merely odd. She was in some vague but deeply felt way ungodly. And ungodliness, unlike eccentricity, could not be tolerated. It had to be contained. It was during this period that Estelle Caulfield came to Vera's door. She came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, her face flushed from the 2-mile walk, her breath coming in short gasps. She was 4 months along now, her belly just beginning to round beneath her wool coat, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as though she expected to see someone following her. Vera opened the door and found the young woman standing there with her hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles were white. "I am sorry to come without invitation," Estelle said. Her voice was thin and rapid. "I know what people say. I know what they would think if they saw me here. But I did not know where else to go." Vera stepped aside and let her in. The story came out in fragments. Estelle had been having sharp pains in her abdomen for 2 weeks. Dr. Mosley, the town physician, had told her it was normal. Growing pains, he said, nothing to worry about. But the pains were getting worse, and Estelle did not believe him, and she had heard through the intricate network of gossip that Bernice Osgood managed, like a general manages intelligence, that Vera knew something about herbs and remedies. Vera asked questions. She felt Estelle's forehead. She asked what the young woman had been eating, how much water she had been drinking, whether the pains came in waves or held steady. Estelle answered each question with the desperate thoroughness of someone who had not been listened to in months. Vera made her drink water, slowly, 3 full cups. She steeped dried yarrow and chamomile in hot water and had Estelle sip it while lying on the bed with her feet elevated on a folded blanket. The sod house was cool inside a welcome relief. Estelle lay back and closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, her face unclenched. They were quiet for a long time. Then Estelle spoke again, and what she said had nothing to do with her belly. "I did not come only because of the pains. I came because I wanted to see you, to ask you something." Vera waited. "How do you do it? How do you live alone and not be afraid?" "Bernice tells me what to think. Cyrus tells me what to do. Dr. Mosley tells me what to feel. Nobody asks me what I want. Nobody asks me anything. I watched you building this house from my window week after week, and I thought that woman knows what she wants. That woman is not asking anyone's permission." Vera looked at the young woman on her bed, this girl who was barely 24, pregnant, and scared and brave enough to walk 2 miles to the home of the town pariah. And she told her the truth. "I am not brave, Estelle. I am just out of things to be afraid of. When you have lost everything, it looks like courage from the outside. But it is just arithmetic. There is nothing left to subtract." Estelle's eyes filled. She reached out and took Vera's hand, and Vera let her, and they sat like that in the cool earthen room while the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. When Estelle left, she paused at the door. "Please do not tell anyone I was here. If Bernice finds out," she trailed off. But the sentence did not need finishing. Vera watched her walk back toward prosperity, a small figure growing smaller against the big land, and felt something she had not felt in months. She felt needed. It was a sensation so unfamiliar it took her several minutes to identify it, like hearing a word in a language she had not spoken since childhood. Someone had come to her door, not out of duty or pity, but out of trust, and the weight of that trust settled into her chest beside the weight of her grief, not displacing it, but sharing the space 2 tenants in the same room. 3 days later, Vera woke before dawn to find that someone had dug into the base of her north wall with a shovel. The damage was deliberate, not the random rooting of an animal, but the purposeful work of a tool wielded by human hands. A section of the lowest sod course had been partially excavated, the dirt scattered, the grass, roots torn. If she had not caught it, if the rains had come, water would have seeped into the foundation and weakened the entire structure from below. She repaired it. She spent the morning cutting fresh sod, packing the hole, tamping it solid. Boulder paced the perimeter of the house, agitated, his nose to the ground, reading a story in scent that Vera could not access. 3 nights later, it happened again. Deeper this time, more aggressive. The shovel marks were wider, angrier. Whoever was doing this was not trying to be subtle. They were sending a message. Vera repaired the wall a second time. She did not report it to anyone. There was no one to report it to. The sheriff, such as he was Fletcher Underhill's cousin. The church was Merle Osgood's domain. The general store, the saloon, the livery, every institution in prosperity was part of the same organism, and that organism had decided that Vera was a foreign body to be expelled. That night, sitting in the dark with the spade across her knees, waiting for the saboteur who did not come, Vera felt a new kind of anger rise in her, not at the people of prosperity, at her grandfather. She whispered into the darkness, her voice barely louder than a breath. "You promised the land would protect me. You said it would keep me safe, but you did not warn me that people would try to tear it down. You gave me the knowledge, but you did not give me anyone to share it with. You left me here alone with your wisdom and their hatred, and I do not know if one is enough to survive the other." Boulder pressed his head against her knee. She put her hand on his broad skull and felt the slow thump of his heartbeat through the bone. Old Jewel came the next day. She appeared at Vera's door without announcement, carrying a bowl of corn porridge hot with a cloth over the top. She sat down on the ground outside the entrance and set the bowl between them. This was the first time Jewel had come to Vera's home. The first time she had done anything more than nod from her bench in town. Vera sat beside her. They ate in silence. The prairie stretched before them, the grass winter brown, now the sky high and pale. Then Jewel spoke. Her voice was dry and flat, the voice of someone who has kept a story locked inside for so long that it comes out without emotion like water from a stone. 1856, Jewel said. Judson and I had 2 houses, right here on this land before prosperity, before any of them came. A sod house I built small just for me, and a timber house Judson built new lumber, real proud of it. He said the sod house was beneath us, said we were not animals. She paused. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, but they were not seeing it. Storm came in June. Judson was in his house. I was in mine. His house went up in a heartbeat. The wind took it apart in pieces. Boards, nails, shingles, all of it flying. The sod house did not move. I lay on the floor and listened to my husband's house being torn apart 40 feet away, and there was nothing I could do. When it was over, I walked out. He was gone. The house was gone. Just a bare patch of ground with a few nails bent in the dirt. Vera did not speak. She could not. 29 years, Jewel said. I never built a wood house again, and I never told anyone why. Last time I told the story, they said I should move on. Move on. She shook her head slowly, as if grief has legs. She turned and looked at Vera's sod house with an expression that held 30 years of vindication and 30 years of grief and said, "You built right. Keep it." Then she stood and walked back toward town without another word. Vera sat alone for a long time after Jewel left. The porridge bowl was empty. The sun had moved. Something inside her had shifted, not dramatically, not with the force of revelation, but quietly, the way a crack lets light into a room that had been sealed too long. She was not alone in her knowledge. She was not the first woman to build this way and be mocked for it. There was a line of understanding that stretched back through Jewel and through Thaddeus and through whoever had taught him, and Vera was simply the latest keeper of a truth that was older than prosperity, older than Nebraska, older than the memory of anyone alive. She was still part of something, even here, even now. The town council met on the second Tuesday of December. Fletcher Underhill presided. Emmett Haskell was called to testify. The matter at hand was the structural safety of the dwelling constructed by Mrs. Vera Merriweather on Plot 44, Section 12, and whether said dwelling constituted a hazard to the community. Emmett stood before the 5 men of the council and repeated what he had told Fletcher weeks before. The structure did not meet recognized standards. The materials were unsuitable. The design was primitive and untested. There was a risk of collapse. He said all of this without looking at anyone. His eyes stayed on the far wall of the meeting room, fixed on a knot in the pine board as though it were the most important thing in the world. His hands were still at his sides, but inside something was turning, a slow grinding that had not stopped since the night he first stood in the moonlight and watched Vera build. Fletcher called for a vote, a demolition order, 30 days to comply. In the back of the room, Estelle Caulfield stood up. Every head turned. Estelle was pale, visibly pregnant, visibly terrified. Cyrus, her husband, reached for her arm. She pulled it away. I have been inside that house, Estelle said. Her voice shook, but it carried. It is solid. It is cool. It is better than anything I have lived in since coming to this town. Has anyone else here actually walked through her door? Has anyone else here touched those walls? Or are you all voting on something you have never bothered to see for yourselves? The silence that followed was the loudest sound Vera had ever heard secondhand, because Vera was not there. She heard about it later from Estelle herself, who came to her the following day with a bruise on her arm where Cyrus had gripped her afterward, and tears on her face that were equal parts fury and fear. Bernice Osgood had turned in her seat and looked at Estelle with an expression that Estelle described as a look you give someone you thought was yours and just discovered has a mind of her own. Fletcher had waited precisely 2 seconds, then said, "Thank you, Mrs. Caulfield," in a voice stripped of all warmth, and called the vote. Unanimous, the demolition order was approved. The consequences for Estelle were immediate. Cyrus did not strike her. He was not that kind of man. But he stopped speaking to her, which was worse, because Cyrus Caulfield's silence was not the cold, strategic quiet of a man making a point. It was the bewildered silence of a man who genuinely did not understand what his wife had done or why she had done it, and who could not bring himself to ask because he was afraid of the answer. He slept on the far edge of the bed. He ate his meals without looking at her. He went to work at the livery and came home and sat on the porch and stared at the prairie and said nothing, and in the vacuum of his silence, Estelle could hear every unspoken accusation. "You humiliated me. You chose her over me. You stood up in a room full of men and made me look like a man who cannot control his wife." Bernice Osgood cut Estelle off completely. No more invitations to tea, no more visits, no more advice about the baby. The social structure that Estelle had depended on since arriving in prosperity closed around her like a fist, and she found herself for the first time experiencing a fraction of what Vera had endured for months. The difference was that Estelle had Vera. She walked the 2 miles to the sod house every few days now, no longer caring who saw her, and the two women sat together in the cool interior and talked about things that had nothing to do with the town or its opinions. They talked about their childhoods, about their mothers, about the particular loneliness of being a woman who has an opinion in a place where women's opinions are treated as symptoms of emotional instability rather than evidence of thought. It was during one of these visits that Estelle said something that stayed with Vera long after she had gone home. "You know what the worst part is?" Estelle said, her hand resting on her belly. "It is not that they are angry at me for defending you. It is that they are angry at me for seeing something they refuse to see. They cannot forgive me for having eyes." Vera received the notice by mail rider the following afternoon. She read it standing in her doorway. Boulder at her feet, the winter sun throwing long shadows across the brown prairie. 30 days. In 30 days, these walls she had raised with her own bleeding hands, this shelter she had carved from the living earth, would be torn apart by men with shovels and oxen, reduced to a scar in the hillside, and she would have nothing. That night, Vera packed her trunk. She took Alton's boots down from the wall. She folded her blankets. She wrapped her herbs in cloth. She moved through the small room with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who has made a decision and is executing it before the part of her that disagrees can mount a defense. Boulder lay on the threshold. He watched her with his amber eyes, his chin resting on his paws. When she had finished packing and turned toward the door, he did not move. "Come on, boy, we are leaving. There is nothing here for us anymore." Boulder did not stand. He did not wag his tail. He lay there, a 70-pound weight of loyalty and stubbornness blocking the only exit, and looked at her with an expression that said more clearly than any words, "No. This is where we live. I am not going." Vera stood over him. Her packed trunk was behind her. The open prairie was ahead of her on the other side of a guy who would not move. She felt the fight go out of her in a long, slow, irreversible exhale that left her hollow and shaking. She sank to the floor with her back against the sod wall and felt the cool earth through her dress. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids she felt rather than heard the presence of her grandfather. Not his words, but his hands, the memory of his rough palms pressing hers into the soil, teaching her to feel what the earth was saying. She opened her eyes. There beside Boulder's still body in the doorway lay a small bundle she had not noticed before, a bouquet of dried prairie flowers bound with a twist of grass. Jewel had come and gone without a sound, leaving this offering at the threshold the way she had once left bread and honey, the quiet gifts of a woman who knew that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another person is remind them that someone knows they exist. Vera looked at the flowers, she looked at the dog, she looked at the small boots in her hands. Alton's boots, the laces still tied in his clumsy knots. She held them against her chest, and for the first time since the burial, she let herself speak to her son. "I am not leaving you," she whispered. "I am not leaving this place. You are in this dirt and in these walls, and I am staying." She hung the boots back on the wall. She opened the trunk. She unpacked. She was staying. Later that night, by the light of a single candle, Vera unfolded her grandfather's letter and read it to the end. His handwriting grew shakier toward the bottom of the page, the letters wavering, as though written by a hand that knew it was writing for the last time. He had studied maps. He had spoken with the native people who had lived on this land for generations. He had chosen this specific plot for 3 reasons. It sat on a natural elevated ridge. The east-facing hillside provided a windbreak against the prevailing westerly storms, and it was positioned away from the low-ground corridors where the most violent weather tended to travel. The final line read, "I cannot be beside you, Vera, but I have given you the best thing I have, a piece of ground that knows how to hold on to people. Do not build high, do not fight the wind, let it pass over your head." Vera pressed the letter to her chest and sat motionless for a long time, her eyes closed, breathing slowly. He had not abandoned her. He had been here before her, planning, calculating, leaving his protection embedded in the very soil beneath her feet. The land deed was not just property. It was an act of love written in coordinates and contour lines delivered across the boundary between the living and the dead. She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside Alton's left boot on the wall, and blew out the candle. Spring came slowly to the Nebraska plains in 1885, but when it came, it brought something wrong with it. The air thickened. By late April, the humidity pressed down on the land with a suffocating weight, offering no rain and no relief. The dawn and dusk skies burned in colors Vera had never seen before, sickly yellows and deep bruised purples that made the horizon look infected. The birds grew quiet. The insects hummed with a high, frantic pitch. Vera felt it in her bones. She recognized the signs without needing to name them, the way a sailor recognizes the particular stillness that precedes a gale. The land was holding its breath. She went to Prosperity. She found Fletcher Underhill on the porch of the bank. "A storm is coming," she said. "A bad one. Possibly the worst any of you have seen. You need to find low ground, cellars, ditches, anything below the surface." Fletcher looked at the sky, which was cloudless and pale blue, and smiled with the particular weariness of a man whose patience has been tested past its limit. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, "you have spent the better part of a year trying to convince us to live in the dirt. Now you are trying to frighten us with the weather. The sky is clear. The barometer in my office is steady. I suggest you tend to your own affairs." Reverend Osgood, standing nearby, added, "Perhaps this is one more reason you should reconsider the choices you have made." A few men standing on the sidewalk chuckled. Vera looked at their faces, at the closed certainty in their eyes, and knew there was nothing more she could do here. She had come not because she expected them to listen, but because she could not have lived with herself if she had not tried. The knowledge her grandfather had given her was not just a gift, it was a responsibility, and she had discharged it. On her way out of town, she passed Estelle Caulfield on the side street. Vera stopped. She spoke quickly. When the sky changes color, do not stay in your house. Run toward the hill. Come to me. Estelle's hand went to her belly. She was 8 months along now, heavy and slow. The pregnancy having progressed through a long winter of cold walks and warm tea in Vera's home visits that had become the secret rhythm of both their lives. She nodded. Vera walked home. She reinforced the roof with fresh sod. She sealed the window frames. She brought her water bucket and food stores deep inside. She closed the heavy wooden door and sat in the cool darkness. Emmett Haskell did not go home that evening. He walked to the edge of town past the last row of houses and stood on the open prairie, looking east toward the hill where Vera's sod house sat invisible against the darkening land. He had not been out here since the nights he had spent watching her build. He had avoided looking in this direction for months, the way a man avoids looking at the face of someone he has wronged. The demolition order would take effect in 9 days. He had done the arithmetic. In 9 days, a crew would ride out with shovels and chains and pull apart the walls that Vera had raised brick by brick with her own bleeding hands. Walls that Emmett knew with the certainty of a man who had spent his life building were as sound as anything he had ever constructed. Sounder, perhaps. His houses creaked in the wind. Her house was silent. His houses fought the weather. Her house ignored it. He looked at his hands in the failing light. Carpenter's hands, strong, calloused, capable. Hands that had built every home in prosperity. Hands that had also written a false report and signed it with his name. He thought about what it would feel like to stand in that field 9 days from now and watch men tear down something he knew was right, knowing that his lie was the reason they were doing it. He could stop it. He could go to Fletcher tomorrow and tell the truth. He could say, I lied. The house is sound. The woman knows what she is doing. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and walked back toward town, and he did not go to Fletcher the next morning or the morning after that, because telling the truth would have required him to become a different kind of man, and Emmett Haskell was not yet ready for that transformation. The storm would have to do it for him. That night, Boulder did not sleep. He stood at the door, his nose pressed to the gap between wood and frame, and growled. Low constant aimed at something far to the west that no human sense could detect. His growl rose to a whine, and the whine became a bark, and the bark went on and on into the darkness, growing hoarse but never stopping, aimed at the unseen thing that was gathering itself beyond the edge of the world. Vera sat beside him with her hand on his back, feeling the tremor running through his body, and waited. The morning of the Founders' Day picnic arrived under a sky the color of old brass. A greasy yellow light filtered down over prosperity, making every surface look jaundiced. The air was dead. Not a blade of grass moved. Not a leaf trembled. The town set out blankets and baskets in the square, and the laughter that rose from the gathering sounded strange and forced too loud for the heavy silence that pressed down from above. Vera sat in her doorway and watched the western horizon. A line of cloud dark as wet slate was building just above the edge of the earth. It was low and thin and almost invisible, but it was there, and it was growing. She looked at Boulder. The dog was panting, his eyes wide, fixed on the west. She closed the door. She latched it. She sat in the darkness and felt the earth around her solid and patient and old. Outside, the sky continued to darken. The laughter in prosperity grew louder, more desperate, as though volume alone could hold back what was coming. The line of clouds swelled and rose and began to turn a shade of green that no natural sky should ever wear. And somewhere in the belly of that green darkness, something was beginning to rotate. The silence broke at 14 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. It did not begin with sound, it began with the ground. A vibration moved through the earth beneath Prosperity, like the tremor of something enormous turning over in its sleep. The people at the Founders' Day picnic felt it in their feet first, then in their knees, then in their stomachs. Glasses rattled on the wooden tables. A pitcher of lemonade tipped and spilled, and no one reached for it because every person in the square was standing perfectly still, trying to understand what their bodies were telling them. Then came the pressure, a sudden violent drop in the air that made ears pop and lungs tighten. Children started to cry without knowing why. Dogs bolted, horses reared against their hitching posts, their eyes rolling white. And then from the west, a sound, not thunder. Thunder cracks and fades. This was continuous, a low guttural roar that grew louder by the second, the voice of something alive and furious and coming closer. Every head turned. The slate dark line of cloud that had been crouching on the western horizon all morning had exploded upward. It was no longer a line. It was a wall, greenish-black and boiling, eating the sky as it advanced. The sun vanished behind it as though someone had blown out a lantern. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a single breath. The picnic blankets lifted and flew. The laughter was gone, in its place screaming. People ran. They grabbed children plates each other. They ran toward their homes, those tall, proud wooden houses that Fletcher Underhill had financed and Emmett Haskell had built. And they slammed their doors and bolted their windows and pressed their backs against walls that were already beginning to shake. Fletcher Underhill stood on the porch of his bank and watched the funnel descend. It dropped from the belly of the cloud like a finger reaching for the earth, thin and gray at first, almost delicate. Then it touched the ground 3 miles to the west, and the delicacy vanished. It swelled, it darkened, it widened into a churning column of black that began to move across the prairie with the deliberate pace of something that knew it could not be stopped and was in no hurry. Fletcher's hands gripped the porch railing. His knuckles went white. He had built his fortune on certainty, on the solid, dependable logic of investment and return of lumber purchased, and houses raised, and loans repaid. He had believed with the unshakable faith of a man who had never been proven wrong that the world could be organized, controlled, made to behave. He stood now and watched something approach that did not care about his beliefs, something that could not be negotiated with, financed, or persuaded. He could not move. His legs had forgotten how. Emmett Haskell was inside the house he had built for the Hendersons, the finest home in Prosperity. He had raised every beam himself, selected every board driven, every nail. He stood in the center of the parlor and placed both hands flat against the wall. He felt the wood trembling under his palms. The nails in the joints were singing a high, thin whine that meant the structure was flexing beyond its tolerance. The sound of his own craftsmanship failing. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the hammer, the hands that had signed the false report about Vera's house, the hands that had built everything now coming apart around him. Bernice Osgood seized her husband's arm and dragged him through the door of the church, the largest wooden structure in town, its steeple pointing skyward. She pulled him into a pew and they knelt together, and Merle began to pray, his voice cracking, his words swallowed by the rising roar. Estelle Caulfield was in her kitchen when the first window blew in. Glass exploded across the room. Cyrus grabbed her and pulled her toward the cellar hatch, but the hatch was jammed, swollen shut by the humidity of the past weeks. He pounded on it. It would not give. The walls groaned. The roof lifted an inch and slammed back down. Plaster dust rained from above. Estelle remembered Vera's words. When the sky changes color, run toward the hill. She pulled free of Cyrus's grip. He shouted her name. She was already at the back door, pushing it open against the wind, stepping out into a world that had gone black at 2 in the afternoon. The wind hit her with a force that nearly knocked her down. She staggered, caught herself, and ran. 8 months pregnant, belly heavy, lungs burning, she ran toward the hill. Cyrus, after one frozen moment of disbelief, ran after her. Inside the sod house, Vera sat in darkness. The air pressure had dropped so severely she could feel it in her chest, a squeezing sensation, as though invisible hands were pressing on her ribs. Boulder was against her legs, not just leaning but pushing, trying to burrow into her body. The dog was shaking so hard his teeth chattered. The roar grew. It passed through the walls, not as sound but as vibration, a frequency so deep it was felt in the marrow rather than heard in the ear. The candle on the table had gone out. The small windows were black. Vera sat in total darkness and listened to the world outside begin to come apart. It came all at once, the sound of wood splintering. Not one piece of wood, not 10, but hundreds, thousands of boards breaking simultaneously, a cacophony of distortion so immense it merged into a single sustained shriek. Glass shattering in waves, metal tearing, the deep bass percussion of entire structures being ripped from their foundations and hurled across the prairie. Nails being pulled from wood by force, thousands of them at once, producing a sound that was eerily close to a human scream. The sod house trembled. The roof flexed. Dirt sifted from the ceiling and fell on Vera's hair and shoulders. But the walls held. The tons of packed earth and living root that surrounded her did not crack, did not shift, did not yield. The wind passed over the low profile of the hillside the way a river passes over a submerged stone, finding no edge to grip, no height to catch, nothing to tear. Then pounding on the door. Vera lunged forward and threw the latch. Estelle and Cyrus tumbled inside, soaked, gasping, wild-eyed. Estelle collapsed onto the floor. Cyrus kicked the door shut and pressed his body against it. The roar outside reached its peak, a sound beyond sound, a physical force that compressed the air inside the small room until breathing became an act of will. Vera wrapped her arms around Estelle. Boulder pressed against all three of them. Cyrus braced the door. 90 seconds. That was how long it took. 90 seconds for the tornado to cross the half-mile width of Prosperity and continue east into the open prairie beyond. 90 seconds to erase a town that had taken 2 years to build. 90 seconds to settle every argument, answer every question, and render every opinion meaningless. Then it was gone. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Vera had ever known. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of nothing. The wind had stopped. The roaring had ceased. Even the insects were silent, as though the entire ecosystem was stunned into muteness. Vera did not move for a long time. She sat on the packed earth floor, her arms around Estelle, her dog pressed against her side, and listened to the sound of her own heartbeat, the only proof that time was still passing. Then she stood. She went to the door. She lifted the latch and pushed. The light that poured in was golden, almost beautiful, the sun breaking through the torn remnants of the storm clouds. She stepped outside, and the world she had known was gone. Where the town of Prosperity had stood, there was now a field of wreckage stretching in every direction as far as she could see. Splintered lumber, shattered furniture, clothing books, broken dishes, twisted metal, all of it scattered across the prairie in a pattern of random devastation that the mind could not organize into sense. The 2-story town hall was a pile of kindling. The church steeple lay on its side 200 yards from where the church had been snapped cleanly, its bell half buried in the mud. Not a single house remained standing. Not one wall, not one roof. The town had been scraped from the face of the earth as though it had never existed. And in the middle of it all, set into the gentle slope of the rise, Vera's home stood exactly as it had stood that morning and the morning before, and every morning since she had placed the last brick the previous autumn. The wildflowers on its roof were bent and ruffled by the wind, but they were still there, still rooted, still alive. The house looked less like something built and more like a fact of geography, a feature of the landscape that no storm could argue with, because it had been there longer than storms had names. Vera stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. Boulder sat at her feet, his tail giving one slow wag. She felt no triumph. She felt a cold, hollow ache, the particular pain of being right about something you wished you had been wrong about. Then she saw half buried in the mud 10 feet from her door a child's shoe, small, brown leather, caked in dirt. Not Alton's. Someone else's child. Some other mother's son or daughter. Vera stared at it and her throat closed. She found herself forming a prayer, the first she had spoken since the morning they buried her boy. Please let the child who wore that shoe be alive. Please. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the debris. They crawled from beneath collapsed walls, from muddy ditches, from root cellars that had partially held. They rose like ghosts from a battlefield covered in mud and blood and plaster dust, their faces blank with shock. They looked around at the empty spaces where their lives had been and could not comprehend what they were seeing. Then one by one their eyes found the hill. They saw the sod house. They saw Vera standing in the doorway. A collective stillness passed through the survivors. No one spoke. Each person was arriving independently at the same unbearable realization the only shelter the storm had not claimed was the one they had voted to destroy. Fletcher Underhill came walking out of the wreckage. His right arm hung at a wrong angle. His suit was torn nearly off his body. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, mixing with the rain and the dirt on his face. He walked slowly, not because he was trying to maintain dignity, but because each step cost him effort and pain. He stopped 10 feet from Vera's door and looked at the sod walls. In his left hand, crumpled and wet, was a piece of paper. Vera recognized it, the demolition order. He had been carrying it when the storm hit. Perhaps it had been on his desk, perhaps in his pocket. It did not matter. He looked down at the paper and then up at the walls it had condemned. The walls that had just withstood the force that had destroyed everything he had built, everything he had financed, everything he had believed in. His legs gave out. He went to his knees in the mud, not as a gesture of supplication, but as a structural failure, the collapse of a man whose foundations had been torn away, as completely as the foundations of his bank and his homes and his certainty. He stayed there, kneeling, the demolition order dissolving in his fist, and said 2 words in a voice that cracked down the middle. It stands. Vera looked at him. She looked at the ruined paper in his hand. She understood what it was. She understood everything it meant, the hubris, the cruelty, the blind confidence that had driven him to sign an order, destroying the only safe structure in the territory. She could have said anything in that moment. She could have let the silence speak for her, let him kneel in the mud with his shattered authority and his useless document and feel the full weight of what he had done. She said, "Come inside, there is water." She held the door open. Emmett Haskell came next. He walked without hurry, his face gray, his clothes torn. He stepped through the doorway and stopped. He placed his right hand flat against the sod wall, the same gesture he had made in the Henderson parlor, minutes before the storm, the gesture of a builder testing his work. But this time the wall did not tremble. It was solid and cool and still. The roots in the sod were alive under his fingers. "I knew it was sound," he said quietly. "I knew from the first night I watched you build. And I lied. I told Fletcher it was dangerous because I could not stand the thought that you were right and I was wrong." He paused. "I built every house in this town. Every one. And they are all gone. Vera looked at him. She saw the grief in his face, the genuine anguish of a man confronting the failure of his life's work, and she recognized it because she knew what it was to lose something you had built with your own hands. She nodded, a single nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. She had received the truth, and she would hold it until she knew what to do with it. Emmett stepped inside and sat down on the floor. Bernice Osgood appeared at the doorway, supported by her husband. Her hair was loose, her face streaked with mud and tears, and something Vera had never seen on it before: the complete absence of composure. Bernice's armor, the judgments, the carefully constructed social hierarchy, the righteous certainty that she knew who belonged and who did not, all of it had been stripped away in 90 seconds, leaving behind a 45-year-old woman who was cold hurt, frightened, and standing at the door of the person she had hurt the most. She could not speak. She stood there, her mouth working, no sound coming out. Reverend Merle Osgood was the one who spoke. His voice was raw and broken and emptied of all authority. He said, "I called you godless from my pulpit. I said you had turned your back on the Almighty, and you opened your door to me." Vera did not reply to him directly. She simply stepped aside and let them in. More came. 23 people in all, cramming themselves into a room built for one woman and one dog. They sat on the floor, leaned against the walls, held their children in their laps. The room was dark and cool and silent. Enemies sat beside enemies. The woman who had mocked Vera sat 3 feet from the woman she had mocked. The man who had signed the demolition order sat next to the wall. He had ordered demolished, and no one spoke because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said. The hours that followed were the strangest Vera had ever lived. She moved through her small home, distributing water from her bucket. One tin cup passed from hand to hand. She tore her bread into pieces and gave them to the children first, then the women, then the men. No one refused. No one complained about the taste of well water or the coarseness of the bread. They ate and drank with the grateful concentration of people who had been reminded in the most violent way imaginable that the basic acts of shelter and sustenance are not entitlements, but miracles. Fletcher Underhill sat against the north wall, the wall that someone had tried to destroy with a shovel, the same wall that had just withstood a force that tore a 2-story building to splinters. His broken arm was cradled against his chest. His face was white. He said nothing. He watched Vera move through the room, this woman he had patronized, dismissed, and ultimately tried to dispossess, now feeding his neighbors from her own meager stores, and the expression on his face was one Vera had never seen on any human being. It was the look of a man watching the architecture of his entire belief system collapse in real time, each act of kindness, another beam pulled from the structure. Emmett Haskell sat near the stove with his head in his hands. A young boy, perhaps 5 years old, had crawled into his lap without asking. The child was shaking. Emmett held him and stared at the sod wall across the room, and his lips moved but no sound came out. He was doing calculations in his head, the kind of calculations he had spent his whole life doing, load-bearing estimates and stress tolerances. But now the numbers told a story he could not escape. The walls around him were 2 feet thick. They had not shifted a quarter inch. The ceiling had held under direct exposure to the most destructive force the planes could produce. He had called this structure unsafe. He had stood before 5 men and said with the full authority of his professional reputation that these walls could collapse. And now 23 people were alive inside them. Then Estelle made a sound. She had been lying on Vera's bed since arriving, quiet, her eyes closed. But now she gasped a sharp intake of breath and her hands went to her belly. Her face contorted. The storm had triggered early labor. Vera moved immediately. She had assisted a midwife in Pennsylvania years ago, another life. She knelt beside Estelle and took her hand. She looked at the room full of people and spoke with a calm authority that no one in Prosperity had ever heard from her before, because no one in Prosperity had ever let her use it. She asked Bernice to hold the lamp. Bernice, who had spent nearly a year trying to destroy Vera's reputation, took the oil lamp without a word and held it steady. Her hands shook, but the light did not waver. She asked Cyrus to boil water on the small iron stove. Cyrus, who had never defended his wife against the town's cruelty, now moved with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that the only thing that mattered was the next 5 minutes. He fed kindling into the stove with hands that were bleeding from climbing through wreckage, and he did not notice the blood. The labor was hard and fast. Estelle gripped at Vera's hand with a strength that left bruises. The room was silent except for Estelle's breathing and the occasional murmur of Vera's voice, steady and low, guiding her through each contraction. At 27 minutes past 9 in the evening, the baby was born. A girl. She came into the world screaming, her voice filling the small sod room with a sound that was the absolute opposite of everything that had come before it. Not destruction, creation, not ending, beginning. The survivors huddled in the darkness heard that cry and went still. Several of them wept, not for what they had lost, but for what had just arrived, a new life, born in the one place the storm could not reach, in the home they had tried to tear down. Vera lifted the baby and placed her on Estelle's chest. Her hands were shaking. Not from exhaustion. The last time she had held an infant this small, this new, this impossibly fragile, it had been Alton. She had held him in the delivery room in Pennsylvania while Nora stood beside her, his face lit with a joy so pure it seemed to come from somewhere outside of him. And she had not held a baby since. 3 years. 3 years since she had felt that weight in her hands, that warmth, that terrifying miracle of a new pulse against her own skin. Something broke inside her, not violently, not with pain, like ice fracturing in spring, a slow spreading release that reached every part of her. She was not forgetting Alton. She would never forget Alton. But she was, for the first time since his death, allowing herself to feel joy without guilt, to hold new life and not be destroyed by the memory of the life she had lost. Estelle looked up at Vera, exhausted, radiant, her face slick with sweat and tears. "She was born in the earth," Estelle whispered. "In the house you built. You name her, please." Vera looked across the room. In the doorway, standing where Boulder had lain that night weeks ago, when he refused to let Vera leave, stood old Jewel. The old woman had appeared without anyone noticing, the way she always appeared, like something the prairie itself had produced. She was unhurt. She had weathered the storm in the old root cellar behind her shack, the instinct of a woman who had survived this before and knew exactly what to do. Jewel stood in the doorway and looked at Vera holding the newborn. Their eyes met. And Jewel, who had not smiled in 29 years, who had carried the weight of her husband's death and the silence of a community that did not want to hear her story, did something extraordinary. She smiled. It was small, it was brief, but it transformed her face the way sunlight transforms a landscape, revealing contours and colors that had been invisible in the permanent shadow of her grief. Vera turned back to Estelle. "Jewel," she said. "Her name is Jewel." In the weeks and months that followed, the town of Prosperity was rebuilt. But the town that rose from the wreckage bore almost no resemblance to the one that had been destroyed. Emmett Haskell came to Vera 3 days after the storm, carrying the notebook filled with drawings of her construction techniques. He set it on the table between them and said simply, "I want to learn. I want to combine what I know with what you know. Wood and sod together using the strengths of both. But I need you to teach me." Vera agreed. They worked together through the summer of 1885, an unlikely partnership between the man who had lied about her work and the woman whose work had saved his life. Emmett brought his skill with joinery and framing. Vera brought her understanding of earth and root and weight. What they created together was neither a pure sod house nor a pure timber frame, but something new homes that sat low against the hillsides, their lower walls thick with oil, their upper structures reinforced with wood, their profiles humble and close to the ground. They were not beautiful in the way the old prosperity had been beautiful, tall and proud and visible for miles. They were beautiful in a different way, the beauty of things designed to endure. The first weeks of their collaboration were difficult. Emmett was accustomed to working alone, to making every decision himself, to the particular authority that comes from being the only person in a community who possesses a specific skill. Working alongside Vera required him to do something he had never done: defer. Not because she demanded it, but because in every disagreement about technique or material, her knowledge proved deeper than his. She understood the soil the way he understood wood grain, instinctively, intimately, with the kind of familiarity that comes from a lifetime of paying attention. There were moments of friction. Emmett would suggest a modification, and Vera would shake her head and explain why it would not work, and he would feel the old resentment flare up, the voice that said, "She is just a woman with a shovel, and you are a trained craftsman." But then he would look at the star on the hillside where the old prosperity had stood, the bare ground where his finest work had been reduced to kindling, and the voice would go quiet. It was during the construction of the third house that something shifted between them. They were working on a problem neither of them could solve alone: how to create a roof junction where sod met timber without creating a weakness that water could exploit. They tried 4 different approaches. Each one failed. On the 5th attempt, Vera suggested angling the timber frame inward and lapping the sod over it, creating a seal that used the weight of the earth itself as a compression joint. Emmett looked at the design, turned it over in his mind, and felt something he had not felt since he was an apprentice: the thrill of learning something genuinely new. "That is brilliant," he said. And he meant it without reservation, without the qualification of surprise that a woman had thought of it, without the need to add his own modification to claim partial credit. It was, he would later realize, the first fully honest thing he had said to Vera since the night he stood in the moonlight watching her build. Cyrus Caulfield's transformation was slower and less dramatic than the others, but in some ways it was the most complete. He had been a quiet man before the storm, content to follow the consensus, uncomfortable with conflict of any kind. His silence after Estelle's outburst at the council meeting had not been cruelty. It had been cowardice, and he knew it, and the knowing had eaten at him through the long winter and into the spring. After the storm, after watching his wife run pregnant through a tornado toward the one person in the territory she trusted, after kneeling in a sod house holding his newborn daughter, while the woman he had failed to defend gave orders that everyone obeyed, Cyrus began to change. He did not become loud or assertive. That was not in his nature. But he stopped looking away. When someone spoke unkindly about another person, Cyrus would meet their eyes and hold them until the speaker fell silent. It was a small thing, but in a town that was rebuilding itself from the foundations up, small things mattered. He came to Vera one afternoon alone and stood in her doorway for a long time before speaking. "I should have stood up at that meeting," he said. "When Estelle spoke, I should have stood beside her. I should have said what I knew was true. Instead, I pulled her down." Vera looked at him. She saw the weight he was carrying and recognized it as the same weight she had seen in Emmett's face, in Fletcher's eyes, in Bernice's silence. The weight of knowing you could have been better and were not. "You are standing now," she said. "That counts." It was not absolution, but it was enough for Cyrus to walk home a little straighter than he had come. Fletcher Underhill, his arm in a sling that he would wear for 3 months, became Vera's most vocal advocate. The irony was not lost on him, and he did not try to hide from it. He spoke to every newcomer who arrived in the rebuilt town, and what he said became a kind of local scripture. We named this town Prosperity because we thought the word meant tall buildings and money in the bank and pride in what we own. We were wrong. Prosperity means having the sense to bend instead of break. It means knowing the difference between a house and a shelter. We learned that lesson the hardest way there is, and we learned it from the woman we tried the hardest to silence. Bernice Osgood never apologized. Not in words. That was not in her nature, and Vera, who understood something about the limitations of human pride, did not expect her to, but Bernice began bringing food to Vera's home every Tuesday. Soup in winter, preserves in summer. She would set the dish on the threshold and leave without lingering, and Vera would find it there the way she had once found Jules' bread and honey, an offering made in silence because some debts are too large for language. And when occasionally someone new to town would begin to gossip about a neighbor, Bernice would go quiet. Not the old quiet, the weaponized silence she had once used to signal disapproval and orchestrate exclusion. This was a different silence. The silence of a woman who had heard her own words reflected back to her in the roar of a tornado and understood finally irrevocably what cruelty sounds like when the walls come down and there is nowhere left to hide. Estelle and Cyrus Caulfield settled on a plot adjacent to Vera's. Their new home, designed by Emmett and Vera together, was the first of the hybrid structures, half earth, half timber, with a nursery whose sod walls kept baby Jewel cool through the scorching summer of 1886. Estelle became Vera's closest friend, the only person who could knock on Vera's door at any hour and be welcomed. They did not talk much. They did not need to. They sat together in the evenings, two women on the prairie, one with a baby on her lap and one with a yee at her feet, watching the sky change colors over a landscape that had taught them both the same hard lesson. Vera Merriweather never married again, but she was never alone. The community that had shut her out became her family, bound to her not by blood or affection, but by something stronger, shared catastrophe and common truth. They came to her not with pity or condescension, but with a quiet, hard-won respect that had been earned in the most absolute way possible. They asked her to teach their children to read the weather. They asked her to help them choose building sites. They asked her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with construction, simply because she had proven herself to be the kind of person whose judgment could be trusted when it mattered most. Her legacy was not written in books or carved on monuments. It was written on the land itself, in the low, sturdy homes that dotted the hillsides around Prosperity, in the way people began to watch the western sky each evening with a mixture of wariness and reverence, in the understanding passed from parent to child that the greatest strength is not found in standing tall against the storm, but in having the wisdom to lie low and let it pass. On a quiet afternoon in the autumn of 1886, a year and a half after the tornado, Vera sat in the doorway of her sod house. Boulder lay beside her. He was slower now, his muzzle beginning to gray, his joints stiff in the mornings. But his eyes were the same, amber and steady and full of a loyalty that asked nothing in return. The wildflowers on the roof were in their second bloom, purple coneflower and black-eyed Susan and wild bergamot, their colors vivid against the tawny grass of the hillside. From the valley below, the sound of hammers drifted up softer, now more measured, the rhythm of people building close to the ground. Estelle walked up the hill carrying baby Jewel. The baby was 7 months old, brown-haired and bright-eyed, with a laugh that came easily and often. Estelle set her on a blanket on the cool earth floor inside Vera's house, and the baby lay on her back and looked up at the saw ceiling where the roots of the prairie grass hung down in fine tendrils, reaching toward the ground, even from above. She reached up with both hands and grabbed a root and pulled, and when it held, she laughed. Vera watched from the doorway. Then she turned and went to the wall where Alton's boots still hung on their nail. She had looked at them every morning and every night for 2 years. She had memorized the scuffs on the toes, the clumsy knots in the laces, the curve of the small leather soles that still held the shape of her son's feet. She took them down. She carried them to where baby Jewel lay on the blanket and set them beside the child, not on her feet, beside her, close enough to touch. It was not letting go. She would never let go. It was something else, something she did not have a word for. An offering, perhaps. A transfer. The love she had carried for a boy who was gone, placed gently beside a girl who was here, not replacing one with the other, connecting them, drawing a line from loss to life, from the child she had buried to the child who had been born in the house she built in the earth that had held them all. Old Jewel appeared at the doorway. She had a way of arriving at moments like these, as though the prairie itself sent her. She looked into the room and saw Vera kneeling beside the baby, saw Alton's boots lying on the blanket next to small reaching hands, and understood everything without a single word of explanation. Jewel did not nod this time. She did not need to. She smiled again, and this time the smile stayed. It settled into the deep lines of her face and remained there not as an expression, but as a permanent change, a shifting of the geography of a face that had been set in grief for 3 decades. Vera stood and walked back to the doorway. She leaned against the frame and looked west, where the horizon stretched wide and golden under the late afternoon sun. The sky was clear. The air was warm. The grass moved in long, slow waves across the hills, the same grass whose roots held her walls together, whose patience and strength had outlasted every nail and board and beam the town had raised against it. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid of the ground beneath her feet, and now standing in the doorway of the home that had survived everything, surrounded by the people who had finally learned to listen, she was no longer afraid of the sky above it either. Boulder's tail thumped once against the earth. Inside, baby Jewel laughed, and the prairie, vast and ancient and endlessly patient, held them all.